Really not a simple thing, at least not in America. And I want to introduce it to you, and I've talked about it before, but I want to introduce it to you in this segment by way of a story. When I was a younger man and I was assigned to working gangs in South Central Los Angeles County, at least in South Los Angeles County, I was in an agency that was surrounded on many sides by different groups of gangsters, and I was assigned to work gangs. And our assignment was very different. We didn't wear a standard police uniform. I wore Levi's and I wore like a polo shirt. I did have a Sam Brown with a gun belt, all of that, but we had a slightly softer version of the uniform. And the car we drove did not have a light bar. It was a slightly softer version of a police car. Our goal was to know the resident and adjacent communities' gangsters well enough to know them by name, by description, to know something about their personal lives, so that when somebody mentioned somebody was involved in a crime, we were at a database in our heads. We knew who everyone was. And we did that by spending time in community in conversation with gangsters in every shift. We would, if we weren't on a call, if we weren't handling a case, we were just out hanging out with gangsters and talking to these different cliques of kids. And they were very different by their nature because we had four, at least in our city at the time, we had four dominant kinds of groups that we had to deal with. And we had in the North End African-American gangsters. We had on the East Side several cliques of Hispanic, multi-generational Hispanic gangsters. In our South End, we had stoner kind of skinhead white gangsters. And in our West End, believe it or not, we had Korean gangsters. Most of the time when people think of the Korean culture and the Korean community, they have a tendency not to think of them being involved in gang activity. But we did have some gangsters who were involved in gang activity in the West End. So these are the four groups we were dealing with. And we got to know members of each group, know them well. Talked about their home life, about how they grew up. And so I got a chance to see what they were all about. And at the time, my kids were younger. My two boys were like 2 and 4. They're now 26 and 28, so you can tell how long ago I'm talking about it, some time ago. And I remember at the time thinking, man, I don't want my kids to grow up and have the same kinds of problems that these kids do. And as I got to know these kids who were gangsters, I realized that you couldn't help but like them. I mean, there was some things about these young men that I saw great unrealized potential. And it used to drive me crazy. Because I thought, well, this kid is, I mean, he wants the same things that I'm sure my boys are going to want. The same things that I wanted not that many years ago before that when I was a teenager. How is it that this kid ended up repeatedly on the wrong side of the law, doing things that he should not be doing? Given that he seems like a good guy, a good kid. And I understand his impulses, his impulse for community and belonging and purpose and protection and a certain sense of mentoring that occurs between generations of gangsters. And I asked myself, my gosh, given the nature of these kids, they don't seem like they're all that bad in so many ways, but why are they gangsters? What is the common denominator that unifies all these? Because it clearly wasn't race. And it wasn't economics, because like the Korean gangsters we were working were very wealthy compared to the Hispanic gangsters who weren't as wealthy. It wasn't kind of even personal history of a community, of racial community, because we had white, Hispanic, African-American, Korean. It wasn't region. They were all living in the same city. It wasn't any of those. What was it? They had different, they didn't share any of these things you typically think of that is a contributor to gang violence or to gang membership. So as I started to learn who they were and started to understand what they were going through, I realized that they had something in common. All of them suffered from lack of dad. All of them. And lack of dad looked different in each setting. I hate to generalize, but so I won't generalize to each group. But I'm going to say for some people, some of those kids I knew, they never knew dad. Mom really wasn't close to dad. Mom, maybe had kids with several different partners, and dad was never involved in their lives. For some of them, they knew who dad was. Occasionally, they got to see dad and knew him by name, but maybe he was locked up so often that he was never around for them. Some of these kids had a dad who was home, but it was a deadbeat dad, would never get off the couch or was drunk all the time. Some of these kids had dads that were never involved in any kind of criminal behavior, were never involved in drunkenness. They were just workaholics who worked so diligently to build their careers and to build their family businesses that they didn't even pay attention to their kids. And so they were absent as well. What struck me was that lack of dad looks different for every group, and you have to realize that it is powerful. Doesn't matter why dad's not available. It doesn't matter why dad's not involved in the lives of young men. What matters is that when dads are not involved in the lives of their boys, things go sideways. That sounds like a stupid, obvious statement. But if you think about it, that is a truth from the ancient past that is affirmed repeatedly, for example, in Christian scripture, that we as a culture have forgotten. We reject now as a culture, would you agree, for the most part, conventional, traditional roles from the past related to moms and dads, to men and women. As a matter of fact, we're in a culture that says you don't even need a dad at home. 2 women can do the same job just as well. Really? I hate to see where we're going to be years from now when we're doing the statistics if we really amplified that idea. I think there is a traditional, ancient role for men and a traditional, ancient role for women in the raising of kids, neither one of which is more important than the other, neither one of which can be removed from the equation. This is a truth from the ancient past that we ought to conserve as we move forward and progress. All of us, even those who would call ourselves the most progressive, pick and choose those attributes of the past that we want to continue to celebrate. I know lots of progressive friends who still celebrate Thanksgiving every single year. It's a tradition. For them, it's just a family tradition, but they would never jettison the family tradition. They want to conserve that. Here's another thing that could ensure the best possible future, but it is grounded in a Christian worldview in which the role of men and women is different. They don't do the same thing. Both issues, both roles are incredibly important. But to suggest that we can remove fathers, and if you simply Google the importance of fathers, study, and I'll start collecting these. Eventually I'll write an article on it. But the point is, if you started to collect the studies, you'll see that this has been studied now in the last 10 years dramatically. And why is it important now? Because we happen to be moving into a generation, into an era, into a time in our history as a people in which we are jettisoning the old roles and suggesting that somehow anyone could do that job. I will tell you this, the young men that I would arrest, it was so common for me. I wasn't even a Christian at the time. I worked gangs. But this was important. And I knew I had to hang on to fathering. It was a call on my own life after I watched these young gangsters. I was not a Christian, but I knew I needed to hold on to my role as dad at home if I wanted to prevent this in the lives of my own kids. I can't tell you how many times I would arrest a young man and I'd get a phone call from his mom on the night of the arrest. She's crying. Wasn't a Christian, but I would spend time because I wanted to know, how did it get this way? I can't tell you how many times moms would tell me, I'm doing the best I can. This boy knows better. I raised him in the church. I had that conversation more times than I care to recall. Moms who were raising their kids in the church, yet no dad in the house, and wondering how it is, given what they had taught their son, that he still was doing things he shouldn't be doing, when he should know better because he was raised in the church. So folks, if you are in the church and you see kids who are in our family who don't have a dad who is acting and is mentoring, who is modeling what it is to be a man, we can make a difference because we can parent. My role model growing up was not my dad. My dad and I were not close growing up. I didn't get close to my dad until I was a teenager. But the role model I had that I looked at every day was a guy named Warner Wallace. He was my grandfather. That was the mentor who I wanted to be just like. And there's somebody in your church setting who's looking for a man he can be just like. That could be you. Take it seriously, because the role of fathers is the one thing from the past we ought to conserve going forward. Hope all this helps you this week as we talk about important social issues. And I'll see you right back here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.